We're going to go ahead and get started. If you're joining us virtually, if you can mute yourself, that'd be great. You can unmute to ask a question anytime and jump in. Also, you can use the chat feature, although I'm not in front of my computer, so I probably won't respond to that very well. But thanks for being here. It's great to see all of you and to talk about worship together. So let's go ahead and get started. I think this is a pretty accurate thing to say, is that most of us have never had a class on worship. And maybe it's accurate to say most of us have never read a book on worship. No matter how much Bible and Sunday school and whatever, you could be in everything that's ever been offered. And it's probably true that in most churches, you would not have had any formal exposure to worship in an educational way. Instead, the way we learn it is by osmosis. We learned it from exposure, and this is just a miniature list here. Napping on parents' lap. Yes, that's the earliest lesson in churches. Shh. Usually followed by, it's almost over. There's a children's moment that you may or may not have gone down for. You were probably told you couldn't take communion. That's an early
until you've been baptized.
Until you were baptized. And then leaving for a children's activity, sometimes children's church or whatever it might be. I think also, leaving for a children's activity or children's worship, children's church. Lots of churches do it different ways. That's another signal that we got. I mean, these were signals that we received growing up.
Mike,
Yes.
we're way too old for that. They didn't have any children's moment. They didn't have any leaving for something else. You just sat there.
Yeah.
Or you went to Sunday school.
So then that's even a new development. So here's kind of my takeaway, that we sense, this is our childhood, we sense this thing called worship was different, special. Maybe even adults use the word holy, which of course totally intimidated us because you could get, I don't know, you could burn in the fires of hell or something. These messages formed us and they instilled reverence. That was always what adults wanted, but also mystery. In my Roman Catholic childhood, which was a very brief stint, I knew this was really different. But you didn't ask questions. Like when my grandmother would dip her fingers in that little bowl of water, I didn't ask questions. This was holy, this was mystery, it wasn't for me. So we didn't really learn about worship. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on making worship meaningful. Weekly worship meaningful. That's the whole premise. And the premise is, if people understood more about worship, you already said you didn't have a class, you didn't read a book about it, you might get more out of it. You might appreciate it more. And the analogy I used in the bulletin to advertise this was cricket. And the reason I did is because when I taught in England, the students said, hey, we're going to watch a cricket match. Why don't you watch with us? And after 10 minutes, they said, you have any idea what's going on? I go, nope, no. They gave me the rules and I said, and then I could start cheering. I knew that was a good play. I knew that was a bad play. You could do it just as easily with football. Maybe some of you are in that camp. You watched the Super Bowl. You had no clue what any of the plays meant. That's okay. I'm not trying to pick on you. But what if that were true of worship? What if we knew the rules? But here's the problem. Worship's not a game, so that analogy breaks down. But it raises this question. What is worship like then? If we're going to put some kind of analogy to it, how is it like or unlike a concert? And notice I chose a kind of, we'll say a rock concert and the symphony next to it. Is it like one of those but not the other? Some churches it might be more like one than the other. Mm-hmm. But is it like a concert or is it not like a concert? Is it like an assembly, a classroom? What is it like? What is this genre called worship? And here's a really good question. Why do we call it a service instead of a meeting? So what we're going to do is tonight, we're going to look at some biblical texts What can we take away from those? We're going to look very briefly at a history of Christian worship. What was it like at first? How has it changed? And that is just foundational so that next week we can look at the theological. So theological in this sense means let's look at the big picture of what can we glean from the Bible and history and how things have developed so that we can make some kind of conclusions about it. And then the practical, what does it mean to plan worship for Sundays? What goes into it? How does that happen? Is there something I'm missing? I know how to sing, I know how to read, but what's going on behind it that might help me understand it the way if you understood a certain play in cricket or football or at the symphony when they say, let me tell you a little bit about the piece you're getting ready to hear. That's what they're doing. I don't know if I should say feel free to use the chat feature because I probably won't even respond to it. But, put it in there and chat with each other if you're one of those at home. And just unmute and ask me the question. I do have some times built in for questions along the way and also at the end. And you can always email me because I like to talk about these things. All right, so biblical perspective. First thing we have to say is two caveats. Neither testament prescribes how to worship. There are no passages that say this is how worship should be done. Why wouldn't they? Because why would you? They already knew they were doing it. Why would they need somebody to say, well, here's how you do it? Now, there could be corrections to it, like Paul does at Corinth. He could say, well, when you come together and you're doing this and that, but he's not trying to tell them how to do it. He's trying to say, you already know how to do it, but maybe this little part's wrong. So they don't prescribe it. They don't even describe people that worship. So anything we get out of the Bible is going to have to be us working at kind of drawing out a lesson or an insight. So here's what I'm saying. Rather, we get glimpses into worship, and then I added sort of. All right, so let me explain. Tricky slide here. The word worship does not occur in the Bible. Not exactly. Why am I saying that? Well, because the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible is a Hebrew-Greek document that we've translated. So the word worship's not going to be there because worship's an English word and it's not a Greek or a Hebrew word. But there are Hebrew and Greek words that we've translated and used the word worship. So I could start by saying, if we had time, this would be a really fun exercise. What's the definition of worship? That's an English word. What's the definition? I'm not asking you the meaning of a Greek word or a Hebrew word. I'm saying, what's the meaning of this English word, worship? And we'd probably come to a pretty clear understanding. We'd all say, well, we don't know exactly the definition, but we know it when we see it. We come on Sundays, and there's different flavors out there. Even our 901 is not the same as 11. We know what it is. Okay? But here's the etymology of the English word. We get worship. You can see how that got changed. The word is first used in the Book of Common Prayer in 1549, and in the vows. And it's the groom's worship consists of his giving his property and body to wife. So there's a kind of self-giving, giving over of self. And not very long after that, when the King James gets written, it's used for Hebrew and Greek words that mean things like obedience, sacrifices, the most common, bowing down. So worship, I'm using quotes there, in the Bible, this is a great little line, is more about service than services. Like we have 3 services on Sunday morning, the Bible says, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's talk worship. And they're going to talk about bowing down, offering sacrifices. So you see how, in terms of etymology, in terms of definitions, we're apples and oranges here. The Bible's going to talk about rendering service, and we talk about going to church. That's not the way the Bible's going to talk about it. But as I mentioned, we can draw out ideas, though, and then I can show you in the history part, how did we go from what it was to what it is? All right, so we're going to look at some passages. And the first one is Exodus 3, 1 to 14. I'll read it and just listen for anything that just jumps out at you. Think in terms of worship as we know it. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then he names all the people that live in the land. The cry of the Israelites have now come to me. I've also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you'll worship God on this mountain. Oh, I heard the word. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What's his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. What do you hear? Insights into worship, anything that you just can glean.
When you took off the sandals, it was somewhat like bowing down. It was holy ground.
Yes, yes. Holy ground, bowing down, that's really the meaning
Kind of
there.
dramatic with the burning and all that stuff.
It's very dramatic. We don't tend to have a burning bush on Sundays in our church.
We have a big organ now.
We have what?
Candles.
Candles.
Yeah.
Yeah, candles.
Give us the presence of God and communicate with God.
Yes, presence of God, communicate with God. Anything else just jump out at you? So here's just a few things. You've already said some of them. This is what's called a Theophany Passage. Just fancy word for the appearance of God. God appears. Well, that, we hope, is what happens on Sundays. Not in the literal sense. Moses doesn't see God. It's also, though, did you notice it's a call passage? Theophany does not occur in the Bible except related to call. There are no passages in which God shows up and the next verse says, and the people had goosebumps. They thought it was awesome. They took a selfie and texted about it. God only shows up when there's a mission. So worship can't just be, oh, it was incredible. I just felt, there's none of that. The theophanies are always accompanied with a call. So there's got to be in worship, yes, there's an appearance of God, there is relationship and so forth, but it's got to lead to the human doing something. In this case, it's God's response to justice or injustice. Observe their misery, heard their cries. I mean, the verbs that are used there are numerous. And then you get this look, see, I don't know, did you catch that one? It's almost, well, actually what the Hebrew does is it repeats it over and over the same way, but the translators got tired. And so they sometimes use look, sometimes use see, just to keep it fresh. But if you were reading it, literally it'd be, well, he looked and he saw this, and when God saw that he looked and saw this, and God looked at, it's look and look and look and see and see. And I find that interesting because it occurs 10 times, but also that notion, which is a really interesting phrase, people who are religious are called observant. And here's this kind of language. Moses' who am I, right? He's trying to get out of it, is answered with, The I am. Who sent me? The I am sent me. And that, we get the word Yahweh from that. That's really the word that's used. Nobody's totally clear how to translate it. Some people call it the ising one, the one who is, who always is. But here's the thing. In the ancient world, to have somebody's name is to have some kind of access / control. You've been given something when they give the name. Remember Jacob wrestling in the night? Well, give me your name and I'll let you go. God gives God's name to Moses. So the sovereign servant relationship is established, which in worship we recognize we're not in the presence of a good friend who happens to be named God. We're in the presence of a totally other being. And we recognize our kind of inferiority to that. But, and this is the last thing I would say about this one, but what begins in deference, holy land, ground, take off your shoes, I'm not worthy. But there is this intimate conversation that takes place and the divine name is given. So worship for me would have to be some kind of, there's a holiness, but there's also an access. But it's not a chummy access because there's still this holiness. So it's a really fine line, and worship services always struggle to figure out how accessible do we make God without sacrificing God's holiness, and how holy do we make God, or transcendent do we make God without losing the intimacy that we have. And I usually think of that in terms of the mood of a worship service. Okay, here's another one. Isaiah 6. You'll know this one as well, even if you don't recognize just the reference. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people. And then you get this message that Isaiah is supposed to go and deliver. So what do you hear in that one? I'm going to guess that you hear something you heard in the previous one. No?
You hear the higher power and then the difference between just that.
Definitely hear this.
Person and the-
Yeah, the sovereign and the servant, however you want to put it. Yeah. Clearly, Isaiah and God are not on the same plane, right? I mean, the angels' full-time job is to go, holy, holy, holy. They don't do that for Isaiah. What else?
There is a call.
Yes, exactly. It's another theophany, and it leads to a call. Well, who will go for me? Not who has goosebumps, who likes this song, who wants to have church be at 10 instead of at 9. It's none of that. It is, here's what I want you to do.
And it's intimate.
It is.
Call, I will, here I am.
Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
Well, I hear the forgiveness of sins and whatnot, and that's something that I don't hear in our worship.
Yeah, occasionally in the
Occasionally.
prayer confession, there will be, and in the pastoral prayer, there'll be a piece of confession.
Right.
And at Lent, we'll have more of it than not. But you're right. There's actually 2 things I used to tell my students in this passage that are not typical in worship, and one of them is confession. I'll get to the other one here in a second.
I sense that there was a statement of humility being made, which maybe that's a variation of confession.
Yeah. Good. With masks on, it's really hard to read. It's really hard to read the room. There's a reason those poker players wear sunglasses, hats down. Okay, so it's no theophany. Sometimes prophets are called by the word instead of by an appearance, where the Lord came to. But in both of the ones we've looked at, God comes. God shows up. And again, it's coupled with a call. Already said that. But here's the other one that's usually missed. It prefaced it with mourning. Did you hear how it started? In the year that King Uzziah died. So you'd have to know Israel's history. They had good kings and bad kings. He was one of the great kings. So this is why George Buttrick back in the 60s preached on this the Sunday after JFK's assassination. In the year that King Uzziah died. So he is going to the temple in mourning for his loss and the nation's loss of a good king. And what does he see? The king. God's on the throne, right? But it points to the room for lament in worship. There are places and times you can go to worship, and there's an unspoken rule that says you should leave any sorrow you have at the door. Because we're here to praise the Lord. Let's forget about ourselves and praise the Lord. And I've even watched where pastors will say, joys and concerns, in smaller churches where they do that. And it's almost like, we've had enough of the downer stuff. Anybody have a good thing to share? We're not big on room for lament. I mean, if anybody in the parlor says, how's it going? And you say, it's falling apart. That's not really what we want to hear. Have a cookie. We've got it occurs in the temple, house of God. The vocation of the heavenly beings, the seraphs, is worship. Sort of bowing down, not worship in the way we sense it. And modesty. It says with two they covered their face. The two that covered their feet is not an exact translation. It's genitalia. I don't know why they couldn't say that. God's presence, though, evokes a confession. Recognizing the holiness of God, Isaiah recognizes his and the nation's sin. Right? It's personal and corporate. And then there's forgiveness and restoration. There's some pain involved in that. I'm pretty sure a live coal on your lips would not feel good. And it ends with this commissioning, right? Who will go for us? Here I am, send me. All right, so one more in the First Testament. This is Micah 6:8. Now, you know Micah 6:8, but Micah 6:6-8 is a little different. I'm going to read 8 first because you've heard it. He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? You recognize that one? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. So that verse gets quoted all the time. But here's the context, and you'd actually have to go back to read all of 6. But 6:6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? How should I come to worship? What do I bring? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So, okay, what exactly do y'all need here in the church? Do I need to sacrifice my kids? Like how big a commitment am I making here? And the answer is, God's told you. What does God require? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. So in a sense, God does not seem to care about, and all of those references are references to how worship was offered in the temple. God seems to put justice over that. And we'll talk about that a little more next week. But I think it's crucial that you don't just apply this to Judaism and say, yeah, that's how the temple system worked. Those Jews, they just thought they could earn their way by offering this and that. I think this needs to also apply to Christian worship, that God's not interested in, and we have to figure out, do we mean relatively or just not interested in our songs, our tithes, our offerings, is God only interested in justice, or is God kind of fed up with worship that doesn't also lead to justice? And you hear the difference there, right? So again, something for us to think about. Okay, so now we're into what we typically call the New Testament. Luke chapter 4. So I'm reading 16 to 21. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All right, so what do you hear that we might draw something out of?
You're supposed to serve.
Supposed to serve. Yeah, I mean, that's the text, right? The text that Jesus reads is about serving. It's justice. What else? Y'all are good at this. Don't be bashful. You're really good at this. All right. So,
It's
Go ahead.
interesting that at the end he says, it has been fulfilled in your presence. And what does he mean by that? Because he is serving us as we are then, gracious of him or so God.
good.
Is there something about Jesus is reading the Bible and then applying it to life? And it seems to me that that's one of the messages of worship.
Yeah, we do
Or at
that,
least
don't
the
we?
sermon. Yeah.
We've been doing that. I mean, it's older than thousands of years. It's multiple thousands of years. Is to read the scriptures and to make some kind of present day application of it.
Jesus announces that the kingdom of God is present.
He does, doesn't he? He reads an Isaiah text and says, this is now happening in him. I mean, yeah. So you can see there I put Jesus' custom as an observant Jew, and it's the 3 S's. He keeps the Sabbath, goes to the synagogue, and there's a value of the scriptures. Those are the 3 S's of good Judaism there. And really, if you think about it, we don't do Sabbath, and we'll talk about that when we get to the history, but we do Sundays, we gather in our gathering place. That's really what a synagogue literally means, gathered together, and we read the scriptures. This is kind of interesting. You may have heard bits and pieces, depending on what tradition you grew up in. There's a thing called a lectionary these days that people read from. Lutherans keep it, Episcopalians keep it, Roman Catholics, some Methodists, some disciples read the lectionary. It's just a cycle of readings. We know there was a cycle of readings in the time of Jesus. When I used to ask my students, when do you think the lectionary was invented? They'd say, I don't know, 1950. And I go, a little older. It actually goes back to before the time of Christ. We know for a fact there was a Torah reading set, first 5 books of the Bible. The prophet, which is where the reading comes from here, scholars debate it. But there's pretty good evidence in this text that there were also assigned readings for the day. So what Luke does is has Jesus go to his synagogue where he grew up. He's the reader that day, and it just so happens to be the assigned reading for the day happens to be about him, his ministry, and what he's going to do. Good news to the poor, release to the captives. So when it says he found the place where it was written, he's finding the place where the reading for the day. And one of the reasons for that is when you have a scroll, you can't flip over to another part. That's why they preach through the Bible that way, because that's the way a scroll works. There's also a reshaping of the Isaiah text. If you looked at the Isaiah text and then looked at the one Luke quotes, the day of vengeance is omitted. So that's a pretty important thing. And then the first word of Jesus, his first preached word in Luke is today. And what he's announcing is Jubilee is now. The kingdom of God is present, Jubilee is now. And of course, there's the social justice implications. All right, so another one in the Gospels is chapter 20 of John, and you'll know this story. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the mark of the nail in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." So this is on the very heels of the resurrection. So what do you hear that we might draw out for worship? There's a lot of good ones here.
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness is there again. What else?
Just the power of belief, I guess, just he doubted him because he didn't see him.
Right?
He says you should believe without necessarily seeing.
Yeah, everybody else in that chapter that believes got to see him. So picking on Thomas is not fair. Everybody that believes in chapter 20 saw Jesus. Thomas says, "Well, I want to be on the same level as you. You saw him, you believe, I want to see him." But then the beatitude is, "Blessed are those who've not seen yet believe." Well, that's John's readers. Don't think about the Sunday called Easter, the original one. Think about 60, 70 years later when that's his congregation. John's congregation has never seen Jesus. Are they going to believe and not being able to see? Well, then there's a beatitude for them. So you notice also it's a Sunday story. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, first day of the week, Sunday, it's the day of resurrection. So we have a shift from a Sabbath story to a Lord's Day story. Remember, John's written 70 years after Jesus. Christians have moved from worshiping on Sabbath and Sunday to mostly on Sunday by this time. And of course, it's the day of resurrection. Fear leads to locked doors. That says more about John's time than it does Jesus' time. That reference to for fear of the Jews is because of the split that happened between Jews and Christians, and I'll get to that in just a second. Yeah.
I heard it is different in different denominations. With my background, I heard profession of faith. And in many worship services, the profession of faith is prominent.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. He does. My Lord, my God. Yeah. This kind is not a theophany. Technically, it's called a Christophany. But notice what Jesus does both times. He passes the peace. That's what we do on Sundays. Carla says, "Would you please greet those around you with signs of grace and peace?" She didn't make that up. And it didn't come from the Book of Common Prayer. It came from the Gospels. People go, really? Is that why we do that? Because the resurrected Jesus, when he showed up, would pass peace. So that's how the custom came to be.
Mike?
Yeah.
One of the things that occurs to me is they're there mourning, and the other thing is they're waiting.
Yeah. So worship that has room for both of those things. Yeah.
One thing that strikes me, since this is about 100 AD, is that the institution of the church is sort of like a kind of flood. So the church itself could forgive sins.
Yeah. Those also, by the way, everybody knows the Pentecost story in the book of Acts, but this is John's version of Pentecost. Jesus breathes on him and says, receive the Spirit. Because in Luke's writings, Luke and Acts, Spirit is about power. And that's the word he uses. But in the Gospel of John, the word is comforter. The one that comes alongside us and comforts. And you get that seeing and believing that we already talked about. I'm going to skip this one. It's a passage in Revelation 5 if you want to look at it sometime. But so is there anything you want to just kind of ask about the biblical? I mean, I know that's a quick survey. Just wait till we do the history survey. If you but just anything jumping out at you or a question? Are you overwhelmed or you're okay?
When they met on the first day of the week, was that a worship service?
We'll get there. Yeah, well, actually, it would be fair to say this. What we call worship does not exist in either testament. Doesn't exist. It's a late development.
What struck me was it wasn't until 1400s, 1500s that worship came to be together and worship God. That was 1500 years after Christ.
Yeah, of course, there we're
So
playing.
was there worship before then? We just didn't have the word for it.
Right. Yes, absolutely. We don't have an English word for it. The word for what we now call worship, yeah, we'll get to it. We're going to do the history now. I'll show you what I mean. I think it'll become clear. So let me give you a couple caveats here, 3 of them. Worship at any place in history. So if you just drop down a probe into any point in history, it's not the same any place at any time. So if I say, well, in the year 1517 happens to be an important year in Christian history, this is the way it was. Where are you talking about? You're talking about it in Germany? You're talking about it in France? You're talking about it in Israel? Egypt? Where are you talking about? It's never the same. So that's true now, right? This is the way history works. Conclusions, observations, we have to derive them. We have to deduce them. It's not all clear. And I don't think it, needs to be said, but I'm saying anyway, we're doing 2,000 years of church history here like that. Actually, we're going further back than that. All right, so here's one way to do it. I think you can think in terms of 5 major shifts. So I'm not talking about periods of time as much as shifts from one period of time to another. So the first one I simply called from temple to table. So here's what I mean. All right, so if you know your Old Testament, if you don't, I'll try and do my best to help you. Solomon built a temple, and the Jews offered sacrifices there. Some translations use the word worship for doing that. That's not what we mean by worship. Remember, that meant you could offer a sacrifice. It meant you could bow down. So Jews worshipped, if we use that term, in that sense, in the temple, but not the way we think of worship. That temple got destroyed when the Babylonians and the Assyrians came into the land, carted them off. You've heard this before, of exile. They are off in another land. You can't go to the temple if you're not there. So they invented a thing called a synagogue that's not anywhere mentioned in the Old Testament. because this period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know that blank page in the Bible, that's like 400 years. So while they're off in this other land called Babylon, they invent a thing called the synagogue. It just means gathered together. And they came up with some rules. You had to have 10 men to constitute one. They meant men. And this is what they did. And they came up with these Torah readings and probably these prophet readings. And a synagogue was, pretty much still is, a place of education and fellowship and socializing before it was ever a place of what we call worship. So synagogues grew up so that when you open pages of the New Testament, you got this thing called synagogue. Didn't even exist in the Old Testament. The early followers of Jesus gathered in synagogues because he's a Jew. Of course they're going to go to synagogue. But also those dinner clubs that go by lots of names. A collegium is the Latin name, an ecclesia is the Greek name. One scholar translates it associations. They're a lot like Rotary Club. There were versions of them. Some were defined by occupation. I'm in one with all these potters, or all these boat people, or I'm in one that's ethnic. A lot of us here from another country, and so we've formed association. Some of them were neighborhoods. So everybody was in these dinner clubs. And so the earliest followers of Jesus, you can call them Christians if you want, proto-Christians, whatever, it was a Jewish movement, and they started worshiping on Sunday, and they still went to the synagogue, but they were in these associations, these clubs, and everybody was in them, but the Christians started to kind of form their own that we now call church. They didn't worship. They ate a meal, they had a talk. And then Herod's temple gets destroyed. So Herod builds a temple as well. That's called Second Temple. And that gets destroyed. And then the tensions with the Christians, the Jews and the Christians, remember this is an early Jewish movement. Well, when the temple gets destroyed and fingers start pointing and lots of other things happen, there starts to be a rift. So that a group that had been mostly Jewish is now kind of Jewish, kind of Christian. It splits, and then there's animosity that grows up until eventually people could say, well, can Jews even be saved? Well, what do you mean? It was a Jewish movement. Can Christians be saved? So it's complicated, but this is where a split happens. And that's why the Gospel of John uses that language. It's very anti-Jewish, unfortunately. And these dinner clubs, these associations, they were influenced by Greco-Roman banqueting. And this is how the early church, the early followers of Jesus primarily met in these homes. And they had a meal and they had a discussion. None of these stages that I just named would resemble worship as we know it now. Not even close. So, secondly, and this is where worship gets born. From catacombs to city hall and the ceremonial. All right, so Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan. It wasn't until later another emperor, by the end of the century, made it the official religion. But Constantine started the ball rolling. Prior to that, Christians had been persecuted. They were living in the catacombs, these burial places, because it was a place of refuge. But with Constantine, when the emperor converts Christianity, it's like, we can come out of the closet. And so they did. So the civil basilica, call it City Hall, where an emperor resigned and had power and held court and so forth, he let them start meeting in there. And this space would look very familiar to you. Long hall, columns. It's a hall, you just stand, you're waiting your turn to see the king who's up there. Well, why do our churches look the way they do? This is where it comes from originally, and some of them look like it even more than others. We're interior columns, cavernous space, a raised semicircular kind of apse at the front. Power up front. Formal patterns of worship in Rome get copied everywhere. Rome did not at this point say, this is how worship should be done everywhere. That comes later. Papal power is very powerful. But at this point, it just happened when people go on pilgrimage and they'd see what they were doing in Rome. 2 emperors before Constantine, Diocletian. This was kind of interesting. Emperors used to wear togas, simple toga, because it was a sign of modesty. By the time of Diocletian and Constantine, emperors are now wearing purple robes and jeweled sandals and slippers. And this influence came from Africa and the Middle East, Persia. And this starts the beginnings of ceremony in worship. They've inherited the basilica, and then there's going to, unfortunately, go along with this some corruption as well. The altar will become central. Now, I'm going way ahead here, but the altar will become central. The priest will have his back to the people, will speak Latin. So we're talking here from 300 all the way up to 1400s. We're talking 1,000 years of development here. And again, no 2 places the same, but what we have is the simple has become ceremonial. Sometimes it's abused, sometimes it's not abused, but ceremonial definitely grows. Prior to the Reformation, preaching orders will build these huge halls and they'll put in something called pews. And the joke I always like is for 1,000 years, people had to stand in church. And it felt like 1,000 years. But they would stand because that's what you did in these, they didn't even think about sitting. And then just prior to the Reformation, the Eucharist was only observed 4 times a year. Communion was 4 times a year, and most people didn't take the cup. Because if you spilled a drop of the blood of Christ, you could burn in hell, or at least go to purgatory. All right, so then something happens called the Reformation. I call it from sacraments to sermon. In many Reformation traditions, plural, the altar will become a table. So in some traditions, Methodist, if this were in the sanctuary up front at the top, this would be an altar. And the Presbyterians, they'd say, no, it's a table. And that was a Reformation move away from an altar notion to a table. Because God's already made a sacrifice on the altar once and for all. It's an anti-Rome kind of stance. And I'll say more in just a second. The pulpit will become central as opposed to one of these, and it'll be raised above the table. If you had any questions as to which one's more important, because what was more important in the Catholic Mass? The Eucharist was. So the Reformation is going to value this preaching. By the way, if you look in our parlor at that banner, 1926, it says church is dedicated. The table is down on the floor and the pulpit's in the middle above it. 1926. Now, I don't know when the chancel got split, but I saw that picture. The Eucharist, in some traditions coming out of the Reformation, for 1,000 years or more, it's been every day, if not every Sunday, and now it's going to become occasional. Presbyterians, Methodists, going to do it once a month. But some other traditions are going to do it every Sunday. Radical reformers, that's more the Anabaptists, the ones who are sick and tired of Rome, they're really revolting against it. They're going to reject almost everything of Roman Catholicism. If Catholics do it, we don't. If they have beautiful places of worship, we will have ugly ones. And that really, they took pride in that. Magisterial reformers, those are the ones who want to reform the church, but reluctantly saw other things being born, like Lutheranism. They're going to have some, like the Episcopal and the Lutheran, they have some things that you'd say, well, you can see how they got that from the Roman Catholics. So this is where the difference between traditions starts to emerge as to how much of Rome's traditions will you embrace and how much will you change. And of course, this is much more complicated. All right, a fourth one, from communion to chrysanthemums and conversions. So here you should think about the states and the westward expansion. The table that had always had bread and wine, or the altar, if you want to call it that, has now given way to flowers and Bible. A lot of churches in this city on a Sunday, the table has flowers on it. Somebody donated those, and their name might be in the bulletin, and there'll be a big open Bible. It's a table. What do you put on a table? Usually food, but we're moving from the importance of communion to the importance of preaching and revivals. So revivalists will move from what had always been the pattern. For a long, long time, the pattern had been word and then table, word and then table, or word and altar, word and Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. And now becomes word, and instead of our response being to go to the table, our response will be altar call. Will you come and accept Jesus as your Savior? And this is part of the Second Great Awakening, which happens to be when disciples of Christ are born. Rationalism and revivalism will compete for worshipers and have ever since. So if I talk about magisterial and radical, this is another division. Some places it's all about very thoughtful, proper, sit up straight worship. Other places, it's very warm-hearted singing and revivals. And this is part of that westward expansion. Okay, a fifth one, from proper to praise and vice versa. Let me explain. Second Vatican Council. You hear the word Vatican, so you know this is a Catholic thing. It happens in the 50s and 60s in our country. It initiates a movement toward, maybe casualness isn't the right word, maybe accessibility. Worship's going to be more accessible to the masses. So the worship can be in the mother tongue of the people gathered, doesn't have to be in Latin. The Eucharist should be celebrated joyfully. Our Catholic brothers and sisters have a hard time doing it, but that was the notion of the Second Vatican Council. Praise songs are introduced. So somebody, I don't know, I think it was 2 Sundays ago, said something about praise music. When did praise music get started and all that? I said, oh, well, the Catholics started that. And this person nearly swallowed their tongue. If you want to know when guitars and drums and all that got into worship, it happened at Vatican II. The Catholics started it, though. And people are shocked. They're like, no, yes, seriously. Active participation was supposed to be a part of it. The congregation would not be watching a show that the priest performed, but would be participating. And then here's an interesting one. At the very same time, some free churches, those who don't have a bishop to tell them what to do, they started to experiment with things like Lent and Advent and labyrinths, and you're like, wait, what? The Catholics, who'd been about all this tradition, are starting praise bands, and the groups that had praise bands are starting to have Lent. Now, it was not that long ago that evangelicals did not use the word Lent. It was Catholic, and now they use it. It's just amazing. I added a sixth, even though I said there's only 5 major shifts, and it's just simply who knows what's next. I don't know if any of you know what Second City is, but you can go online to Second City, and you can pick out an avatar that's going to represent you, and you can go to worship. And you can go to whatever church you want. You can take communion if you want. You can sing the songs. And if you're thinking to yourself, I have no clue what you're talking about, well, go try it. I don't think you'll find it very meaningful, but maybe you will. I don't know. But there's online worship communities that find it very meaningful. Of course, dinner churches, coffee shops, you name it. Nobody knows what's coming. Okay, so I have 5 kind of takeaways for me, but this isn't exhaustive because you point out so many other things. But these are just 5 that stood out for me. Worship's rarely taught, more often it's caught. Not sure that's great. Worship as we know it did not exist in biblical times. Just didn't. And so the words I used in that 3rd one is, and I think those apply, there's a kind of, if we were defining worship, there's a kind of pageantry and a kind of performance that happens. And I don't mean performance in a pejorative way. I mean it in the best sense of the word. You know, it comes from the French for to bring the form through. There's a performance kind of notion that happens. And there's a little bit of pageantry involved. And yes, 901 doesn't have the same pageantry as 11, but there's a little bit of a pageantry involved. But that develops, and you could say, church historians would say, there's signs of it as early as 150. And there's some in the 200s. But it really takes off in the 3rd century, late 3rd century, primarily more so in the 4th century, and then it grows exponentially. Some popes, for instance, and some emperors just really into the pageantry. Worship's always undergone changes, always will. It's because it's culturally influenced. It makes room for pain and praise, and it should be a divine encounter leading to working for justice. So we have 5 minutes left. What are you thinking? What are your thoughts, questions, comments? Yes.
And I'm not attacking anything, but I'm curious, going through history, how do you define justice? What's the concept here of justice? Because this is another transitional term.
Yeah, the justice thing here would be that the right is done for those who are oppressed, for those who are marginalized by society. I mean, the example that's given is in the text is the prisoner, the poor, the blind, because you understand
Of
that.
course, the prisoner is a victim of society. He is guilty
Well, see, the
by the
prison,
mores of the society he lives in.
no, prisons were debtors' prisons.
Debtor's prison. Okay, well that,
Yeah, so you had debtors' prisons. The sick are also included in this because to be sick in that day was not a medical thing, it was a societal thing. You were no longer a part of society because you are unclean. So you're ostracized, you're poor, you're in debtor's prison, you have no food. This is the definition of justice.
I'm struck by how much worship has changed in my lifetime. I remember women couldn't do anything. You couldn't collect offering, you couldn't pass communion, you couldn't do anything.
Yep.
Maybe you could teach Sunday school.
Well, that's true in some churches still.
Oh, geez. And the other thing is, and you had to be quiet. Some of the most exciting times in this church is when we have the meet and greet on the way to communion, and the sanctuary becomes electric. Yet in Bulletin, in the church I grew up in, said, if you must whisper a prayer. No talking.
Right.
How it's changed just in,
Yep.
70.
Well, in my observation, I've only been on staff here 5 years, but I've come off and on for 15 or more years, actually more like 20. And in the 20 years that I've just dropped in, worship changed here. It was much more formal. Much more formal. Yeah.
I was on the first really taught before childhood depression. I did not have that.
Right?
You know my story. I did not have that
Nobody did.
as a child.
You came in late, but that's what I said is nobody gets that.
Right.
Nowadays, in our church, and some of you are mentors in the pastor's class, but that's it. We don't really have, as a part of a curriculum, a class on how to worship. It's an incredible oversight that childhood education in the life of the church doesn't include a curriculum that teaches, like if I said, what does the word doxology mean? Well, we sing one, but I had no clue. What in the world does that word mean? I mean, are you going to risk it all on double jeopardy, final jeopardy? It says the category is doxology. How much are you willing to risk? We'll talk about that word next.
Catholics do, don't they have a school,
Yeah, you go to catechism, but catechism tends to be more about memorizing doctrine than it does about teaching worship.
Kind of non-Catholic, original non-Catholic or something, but they always have to go through.
Yeah.
Mike, I really like the last observation.
I do too. I think God does too. Apparently.
I thought you were gonna simplify things.
Is that complicated? Well, remember this. If the premise of this class is the more you understood about worship, the more you could appreciate it, all we did tonight was lay a foundation of what we could glean from the Bible and what has happened big picture historically. We haven't then pulled back and said, so what do we make of this? And how could that help me on a Sunday make sense of what's going on? And that's what we're going to do in the second. But you can't do the second one without knowing this first part. And when I taught worship, all I did to prepare for this is I took all my class notes of a semester and said, okay, what would that look like in 1 hour? And just boil it down. Because my classes, when we would do this, they would say, I'm in seminary, I never knew this. And it wasn't until fairly recent, within the last 20 years, that seminaries had a class in worship. And when I told people that I would meet somewhere playing, whatever, and they'd say, what do you do? And I'd say, well, I'm a seminary professor. What do you teach? So I teach preaching. And they would instantly think of a speech class. They had no idea that it had to do with interpreting the scripture and doing theology. They just thought it was a speech class. And then I said, and I also teach worship. That they could not fathom because they thought I meant how to worship. Like, here's how you pick up a hymnal, here's how you open a bulletin. And I said, no, it's technically called liturgics, and preaching is technically called homiletics. But what you teach in a liturgics class is you start with this. You start with, what does the Bible say? What have we done with that in history? And then you start to say, so what does this mean theologically? And how do we take that theology and then practically show what it looks like to put a bulletin together and to do worship?
You're having this conversation with somebody who asked the question on an airplane?
Yeah, well, sort of. Yeah.
In the Catholic Church, do they teach worship? Because it seems to be much more ritualized. And you go to one Catholic church and another, they're very.
Well, but see, the reason it's the same, and it's not exactly the same.
Right.
There are very contemporary Catholic masses and very formal Catholic masses. There's, even pre-Vatican II masses that can be rebels. But these are not free church traditions. Pretty much true if you went to a Lutheran church, pretty much true if you went to an Episcopal church. Not exactly, but again, not exactly in the Catholic Church. And that's because they are going by a book. And the book has a liturgy in it. And here's the liturgy that you follow. And here are the readings for this day. And this has been laid out. And there are people, evangelicals, gravitating to that by droves. And there's books written about this very topic. People who are longing for it. They call it Pilgrims on the Canterbury Trail. They're finding their way back to a very formal worship and finding that meaningful. And at the same time, there are people leaving those formal ones for a free expression. And sociology of religion folks just kind of make observations. Well, yeah, that's just the way it is, that a lot of times in the second half of life or whatever it is, there's this kind of move. And some people, their spirituality, they're wired that way.
When you were teaching, your students were diverse.
Oh, yeah.
And as such, when they were through their studies, when they graduated, when they went on to their churches, they all had individual traditions, individual beliefs on what worship should be.
Right.
All is valid for that group and is rewarding for that group as then the one next to it.
Right.
And I think I find that very rewarding.
Yeah, what I tried to say was, I want you to grow an appreciation for traditions outside of your own as you critique yours. I want you to critique yours in this class, and I want you to grow an appreciation for the others.
Yes.
You don't have to agree with the others, but I want you to, if you're going to do critique, you don't need to critique the Presbyterians. You need to critique yourself. Unless you're Presbyterian, then you need to appreciate, And what I did the very first day of class is I wrote down This was really fun. So this would be an average size class. And I'd say, all right, we're going to go around, tell us your name, what year you're in seminary, and here's what you got to do. Tell me how many traditions you've been a part of in your life. So the first person would say, I'm Joy, second year. I was born in a Methodist church, but my dad was Catholic, so we went to, but then in college I visited, and then I got married and we'd go to, and so she would have 5. And then the next person, well, eventually you got the 33 traditions up here on the board, represented Assembly of God, Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, et cetera. And then I'd say, how in the world are we going to talk about worship? And then they would go, I don't know. How are we going to talk about it? You tell me. And I said, well, we're going to start with the Bible and history, and then a theology that should be true of all expressions. It's at the groundwork, but these expressions come up in different ways. So if praise is important, which it is, that doesn't look the same every place, but praise is. But in some places, lament isn't recognized. It should be. It's in the foundation. So you need to find room for that. So we just work through that. And then, you hope that they can take what they're learning and adapt it to their situation.
How easy is it for a first or second year minister to change the traditions in the church he's assigned to?
Not very.
Yeah.
Not very. Yeah, I mean, with the seminary I retired from was Methodist, so they're appointed, they're only going to be there 2 years. It's not likely. And if they make these changes so fast that everybody's head is spinning, it's just going to be a bad situation. So I always said, if you're going to make changes, you have to educate first. And you have to bring everybody on board with why we're doing this so that people understand it. And then you can see about making change. But, honestly, there's so many various varieties of worship out there now that most of them inherit. I don't know, the most common thing nowadays is, you've either got rationalism or revivalism. I don't see a lot of churches where the combination is really good. I like to think ours is, but it could be a blind spot.
Seems to me that one problem can be if you get so tied to your worship has to be exactly a certain way that you're missing the whole point of being a Christian.
Yeah, except, the people that love the book would say, I don't have to go with the whims and culture and always be inventing from scratch. Here's a time-tested, true, Cranmer's words are just absolutely gorgeous, and so they find meaning in the repetition of that. If you think about it, our worship has something new every week, right? We don't sing Amazing Grace every single week, but it has the same thing, exact same thing every week too. We don't say, what? I'm kind of tired of Lord's Prayer. Let's change it. What if we changed it? So what I think good worship does is it has some elements that are always there. And they have some elements that change every single week. And that balance of constancy and change is a really good kind of thing. Some would say that's the nature of God. There's a constancy and there's also this change. But everybody's a little different too.
Some people get comfort from that tradition and that,
Absolutely.
that makes them feel good, that brings them back, that structure.
Right. Absolutely.
It seems that change within a church, an individual church, in many ways, look from the outside is, oh, you're just changing the order, or you're now using a project. We're not talking about their basic change of theology where they say, oh, wait,
Right.
And so I think looking from the inside is different than looking at the outside. We say those people need to change.
Right.
Yeah, you don't get to play in that arena if you're not in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. All right.
Mike?
So.
Mike, this is Barry Speart. Good evening to you. A quick ritual question, if I may. and that's with my Jewish background and my experiences since. If you could touch on kneeling, because for me, growing up in a Jewish environment, kneeling meant a couple things. One, you're a member of clergy, and it was a special time of year. It was a high holy day season. And as my wife and I have been getting out to more and more churches lately, despite COVID and meeting lots of wonderful people, having wonderful times, we're a little bit struck, a little bit quizzical about where the kneelers or kneeling is present and where it isn't. And it's easy to think Catholic Church, but I don't know if that's correct. And how much of it was it democratization that brought it out to all of the pews so that everybody could participate? Can you help me with that a little bit, please?
Well, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that it's one of the postures of prayer, as is in the Jewish tradition, standing is a posture of prayer. And you're right, the Roman Catholic Church, my grandmother, this is another example. Going with her, I didn't ask about the water that she dipped her fingers in. I also thought that the footrests were pretty cool. Until she told me that's a kneeler and there would be times to kneel. Yeah, I mean, it's another example, though, of that word that gets translated worship that is prostrating oneself before the divine. And so we don't, in some traditions, they actually will lay on the floor. That's a very minority kind of experience in churches. But in some churches, kneeling is a part, and it's because of that, that word from the bowing down kind of ritual. All right, well, as they used to say on Car Talk, you wasted another perfect hour. Thanks for being here.